Good morning, everyone. My name is Dana White. Welcome to the fifth in the series of the Talks by Lionel Corbett. I am joined here today by my good friend and colleague, Dr. Gard Jameson, Dr. Linn, and today we have the extra special treat of having Dr. Connie Zweig with us. She has a new book that is about to be released on aging. With that, let me turn this over to Dr. Lionel Corbett.
Thank you, Dana, and good morning. I'd like to talk today about some of the factors that are particularly relevant to late life spirituality. And I'm going to do this largely from a Jungian perspective, because for Jung, the development of our spirituality is really the essential or quintessential task of late life. And it's essential for the full flowering of the personality. Jung felt there would be no evolutionary reason for aging unless it had some purpose for the species. If it didn't have some purpose, we would all die off after we've reproduced. So there must be some reason that we often live to an old age. And for him, after midlife, or beginning in midlife, certainly in later life, our connection to the self is particularly important. And by self here, he means the intrapsychic God image, what he calls the God within. This becomes paramount. A connection to this level becomes paramount in later life. And I'll talk about some of the ways this can happen. Jung also believed that it's very important for older people to do what he calls make culture. By that he means contribute to society, develop the inner life, and so on. Now today I'm going to make a very typical distinction between religion, which is an organized historical institution that's been around for a long time, and spirituality in the very broad sense, which is simply the feeling that life is meaningful in some way, that we have a personal connection to subtle realities beyond the physical world, however you think about them. Or you can define spirituality broadly as the capacity to experience mystery, beauty, awe, and the ability to affirm the value of life. Now, this is an important topic because there's a great deal of research showing that spirituality and religious commitment in old age actually protect against loneliness and illness in later life. This effect is partly the result of belonging to a supportive community. It's not necessarily the result of belief in a traditional theology of some kind. But it helps to have people around you, of course, as you age. What I found is that today it's quite common to find older people who've given up on the religious tradition to which they've belonged, sometimes since childhood, because it simply doesn't work for them, often because its God image does not correspond to what is really sacred to the individual, or because the spiritual teachings of the tradition are unusable. They don't correspond to the structures of the personality. And this is a very common problem. It's not confined to aging, but there are important spiritual teachings like turn the other cheek and love your neighbor and the stress on forgiveness and so on. These are very good advice, but the problem is they only address consciousness. They ignore the unconscious. And you can't implement and live a spiritual teaching that ignores your character structure. So that all the cardinal Christian virtues like humility and charity and love and forgiveness are just not possible if you have a personality that's grandiose, or if you suffer from fear or shame or envy or rage. So that's one of the reasons that ordinary spiritual teaching often has no effect, as we're seeing at the moment. So the development of an individual or a personal spirituality is very valuable, and it becomes particularly important as we face death, especially in later life. And this is where Jung's approach is valuable. I think we don't belong in a religious tradition if its sacred stories don't resonate with us. If the tradition doesn't really help you with your suffering, if it doesn't help you with the problem of evil that goes on all around us, in that case, you don't belong in the tradition. I found that many older people find that the traditional Christian God image found in the liturgy, like the divine as a benevolent sky father or a shepherd or something like that, has become a completely meaningless metaphor. It has no emotional power. I find that sophisticated high-end theology doesn't penetrate into the pulpit. It doesn't reach the average churchgoer. And many people are turned off by the politics of the institutions, like their attitude to women or their attitude to homosexuality or those kind of things. These attitudes have become increasingly impossible to maintain. So if you're an older person and you feel you have to turn away from a lifeless tradition, your individuation process, the development of your personality in late life, means in part the discovery of your own kind of spirituality, your own sense of meaning and purpose, your own values, your own form of connection to the transpersonal dimension, and in particular, your own attitude to death. The word individuation here partly means the full development of the personality. This, of course, begins immediately one is born, but it comes to fruition in later life. Later life is a time when we really put the finishing touches on the individuation process. And it's important to remember that for Jung, the development of the personality is more than the result of the interaction of genes and the environment, which is the traditional approach to development. Because for Jung, the innate God image in us, the self, which is a kind of divine essence or core of the personality, will give us a set of potentials. And these potentials have to embody themselves as we live our life. And this process comes to a final development in later life. And one of the major developments in later life is the consolidation of a relationship with the self. And so I want to begin by talking about one of the ways that we form a relationship with the self. And I just have time to talk about one approach, the main approach, which is by paying attention to dreams. So I want to talk about a very numinous dream about aging, which was given to a woman who was in her late 60s, who was very worried about the prospect of aging. And this is an example of what's called a numinous dream. I don't want to recap all the material that I went through a few weeks ago. I just want to briefly recap by saying that here we're talking, numinous experiences are experiences of the self or the transpersonal level of the unconscious. They're experiences that have a mysterious, fascinating, awesome quality. I gave the examples of Moses at the burning bush or Saul on the road to Damascus, those kind of experiences where one is faced with some uncanny, larger power or otherness that defies adequate understanding. Now, one of the main sources of this kind of experience is in a numinous dream. And the main point about this from a Jungian point of view is that we can't Christianize the unconscious. The unconscious will produce imagery from any religious or mythological tradition with no regard for the subject's preferences, the subject's personal history, and so on. And it may contradict official teaching. And I want to give an example of a dream which does just that. This dream, like many numinous experience, acted as an initiation into the aging process. Sometimes when we're in a transitional period, the self will produce imagery which initiates us into the new consciousness that's required. Now, this is the dream occurred to a woman who was quite concerned about the losses and the physical decline that we're all very well aware of in later life. The problem is that we have no socially sanctioned initiation into old age. Old age tends to be devalued in our culture, and people break down emotionally during transitional periods because of the uncertainty that we experience during these liminal or transitional periods. And the transitional period into late life is no exception. So here's the dream that the woman had, which helped her. and I'm going to abbreviate it a little bit. In the dream, an authoritative voice says, I'm going to teach you about the process of aging. By and large, voices in dreams tend to be experienced as the voice of the self. And so the woman sees this black and white diagram. And underneath the diagram is the head of a very old man. This is her drawing. And you see there's a connecting line drawn from the old man's head to the diagram. And the diagram consists of an elongated sort of square shape enclosing an inner circle. This is the so-called squaring of the circle, which is very familiar to people who know alchemy. And at the bottom of the circle is this crescent convex upward, and out of the crescent arises two heads on long necks. And the voice says, this is an abstract of the Godhead. And there are two heads of God. One is the male head of God, and one is the female head of God. So the dreamer realizes that the heads are in harmony with each other. Their faces are sort of curiously unemotional. And there's a kind of crown at the top of each head. And the old man, she says, looks ordinary and earthy with kind of reddish skin. And the voice goes on to say, you don't understand the process of aging. The process of aging, the reason that we age, is to enable God to rejuvenate. And the voice says, when we are born, God is old. And when we grow old, God becomes young. And when we die, God experiences rebirth. And particularly in old age, it's very important that we don't lose our connection to God, because otherwise we would deprive God of our share in God's rejuvenation, and this disturbs the cosmic ecology. And the voice goes on to say that belief in God constellates the inner child, and this fosters the process of divine rejuvenation. And as we age, we mustn't lose touch with the inner child, because if we do, we also lose touch with the divine. Now, this is a deeply mysterious dream. It's the kind of dream that Jung thinks arises from the archetypal level of the psyche, the mythopoetic level of the psyche, which is the level that's the source of all religious experience. It's a numinous dream. It's mysterious, tremendous, and fascinating, and it doesn't contain Judeo-Christian imagery. In fact, if anything, the image of an androgynous divinity with both male and female heads contradicts the tradition that has an overly masculine image of God. Now, the dream says that the purpose of aging is the rejuvenation of God, and this is a completely novel idea, which the dreamer, of course, didn't understand, but somehow she found it very reassuring, because she got the sense that aging is not just a period of relentless decline towards death. She got the sense from the dream that this phase of her life had a purpose. And in fact, it's very typical of numinous experience of this kind to have a kind of helpful or healing effect, which it was for her. The dream is also what's called a big dream. In other words, it's not just relevant to the dreamer, it's relevant to all of us, to society as a whole. It's also a revelation of the individual's personal myth. She's given a kind of personal revelation. Instead of just participating in a collective revelation, like, say, the receiving of the law on Mount Sinai or something like this, we are given individual revelations when we pay attention to this kind of manifestation of the self. This dream allows the dreamer to distinguish herself from the collective myth into which she was born. The collective myth that we're born into is based on nationality, ethnicity, collective conditioning. But in this kind of way, by paying attention to this kind of imagery, we can discover our own spirituality. We don't have to participate in a kind of mass consciousness. You can only, Jung said that you can only resist the influence of collective thinking if your own individuality is well organized. And again, this is one of the main tasks of later life. Now, this is a good example of how the God image can change as we age. The dreamer was raised in a tradition whose God image is exclusively masculine. So when the dream says that the divine has a feminine head as well as a masculine head, this was a very important corrective. The dream also gives her a kind of abstract image of the self, the bigger self, as a totality, the squared circle, which is neither masculine nor feminine. So it's telling her that the self has these kind of human levels and abstract or transpersonal levels. Now, it was very difficult for us to know what the dream meant by the rejuvenation of God, or what it could mean that when we're born, God is old, but as we get older, God gets younger. I mean, it sounded to me like a kind of Zen koan. So one way is to think about this as a comment on the image of God in the psyche, or the way the self appears to us. Okay. So when we're born, we are immersed in the God image of a particular tradition, which is old. It's been around for a long time. So in that way, God is old. But as we age, our God image changes, sometimes radically. And I think that's what the dream means when it says that God becomes younger. It means the God image gets younger as we work on it. The dream stresses the importance of maintaining a connection to the inner child. So this is a very important teaching. This is, of course, a teaching dream. And of course, in many traditions, the divine appears in the form of a child. Think of the mythologies of Jesus or the Buddha or Horus or Krishna. All these divinities appear in the form of divine children, usually implying renewal and regeneration. So as we age, the dream says we have to cultivate a more childlike approach to the divine, reminiscent of Jesus calling on people to become like little children if they want to enter the kingdom of heaven. I think this means we have to cultivate a simple faith and trust, not a dominant ego. We have to behave in a trusting way, the way that a child relates to a good parent. So this woman's God image was radically transformed by her dream, illustrating Jung's point that as we go more and more into the unconscious, we transform our God image. Now, I find that this kind of contact with the transpersonal level of the psyche, or with the self, is very helpful during a life crisis. And old age is full of life crises of this kind. Because of the inevitable losses we experience at this time. So attention to dreams in later life is very important, because it becomes a powerful stimulus to the individuation process. We get the sense, as we pay attention to this kind of dream image, that we are witnessed or supported by a larger presence than the ego. And this feeling helps us to develop a personal spirituality without any commitment to a specific tradition. Now, one of the effects of a dream like this is what Jung calls the relativizing of the ego. What Jung means by this is that as we age, we discover more and more that we are, in his words, the object of a subordinate subject. In other words, we increasingly realize that something is aware of us. The self is aware of the ego. The ego is not the essence of who we are. We are really part of this larger self. And this is what's meant by the relativizing of the ego. We live in relation to a larger wisdom that determines a large part of our destiny behind the scenes. We relativize the ego also by giving up our grandiosity, our feelings of omnipotence, and we work on character traits like the need to control other people, the need for status, the need for external sources of self-esteem. These are all ways in which the hegemony of the ego decreases as we become more open to the demands of the self in later life without resistance. And this leads to the question of surrender and letting go in later life, which I'll come back to in a few minutes. In the meantime, just a few other aspects of development in later life that are both psychologically and spiritually very important. One is the development of wisdom. This has several meanings. It partly means the ability to be non-judgmental when relating to others. And the way that happens is that as we age, we increasingly develop our capacity for empathy for other people. The more we can be empathic with other people, the less judgmental we are of other people. And I find that empathy is one of those faculties that often develops as we age. Wisdom also means the ability to maintain more than one perspective at the same time, to see a situation from multiple points of view. Also, the capacity to live with paradox increases as we age. And also, as we age, we get better at tolerating ambiguity. Wisdom also means that we can broaden our horizons beyond our own ego concerns, beyond the concerns of our own community, so that we become concerned with humanity as a whole. And the situation that's going on around us at the moment is a very good example of how we need to do that. Now, this discovery of the self is actually a monumental realization, but the evidence for it is overwhelming when we see the accuracy of our dreams and the accuracy of synchronistic events, which are also stimulated by the self. These are so closely tailored to our psychological structures that we realize that we're being addressed by an intelligence that understands us better than we know ourselves. Now, a few words about some other aspects of spirituality in late life. You'll remember that Jung said that after midlife, none of his patients recover unless they develop a religious attitude. By religious attitude, he didn't mean commitment to a specific tradition or a specific creed. He meant the development of a personal spirituality. He meant an individual connection to the self or to sacred reality. This actually is the core of Jung's approach to spirituality at any time of life. Belief in a set of doctrines and dogma is not enough. That's not an adequate basis for faith. Belief in traditional ideas may fade or may be eroded by painful life events. If you believe in a loving, benevolent God and then you have a catastrophic life event, your belief in that particular God image may be shattered. In the face of intense suffering, the teachings of the established traditions about how loving and good God is can seem like mere platitudes. They can have no emotional power. And in fact, then you may need a notion like Jung's notion that the divine has a dark side to it. So belief in doctrine and dogma may not be helpful, but direct personal experience of the self, personal numinous experience, is actually indelible. It leads to knowledge rather than belief. And knowledge is permanent. Once you've had this kind of experience, once you've heard the voice of the self, you know, you don't have to believe. So an authentic spirituality is greatly enhanced by personal experience of the transpersonal psyche. This is why for Jungian psychology, it's actually impossible to sharply distinguish between psychological and spiritual development in late life. They overlap. And in fact, I think they're synonymous. So I would ignore the distinction between psychology as a discipline that's only concerned with this world and personality, and religion as attention to spiritual matters. I think using this kind of approach, you can seamlessly blend the spiritual and the psychological, because the psyche is not purely personal. It has personal levels, but it also has a spiritual or a transpersonal dimension, a mythopoetic dimension that is the source of religious experience and acts as a very important background force within the life of the individual. The transpersonal unconscious is a source of wisdom greatly superior to the ego. So whereas in early life one has to develop an early ego, the older person in particular has to realize that the ego exists in relation to the self, and that a dialogue is possible between them. And when this dialogue is established, the issue of meaning often comes to the fore because these experiences are intensely meaningful. And one of the cardinal features of spiritual development, actually at any age, but particularly in later life, is the discovery of meaning in one's life. The sense that life makes sense. It's not a tale told by an idiot. Without meaning, one often despairs. And this discovery becomes very important in later life, actually beginning in midlife, but especially as we start to accumulate multiple losses and limitations. The development of meaning helps us avoid the sense that life has been nothing more than an inexorable struggle against an indifferent fate. We don't have any control over the losses that occur in old age, but we are free to discover meaning and we are free to pursue a spiritual practice. This allows, such as work with dreams, this allows us to be less vulnerable to despair than would be the case if life seemed entirely meaningless. One of the difficulties we have here is that our culture doesn't ask about the meaning of old age. Society's main interest in aging is the medical and social management of late life. But the major task for the inner world is the task of discovering meaning and the discovery of the meaning and purpose and value of aging. This falls to the individual. There are no cultural norms that the individual can use. So meaning refers partly to the ability to discern a pattern in your life, to make connections between elements of your life that otherwise seem disconnected, so that you can see that your life has formed a coherent pattern or theme. Sometimes you find a theme that's moved through the whole course of your life. And you can discover this theme as you tell the story of your life. Storytelling is a very important spiritual practice which helps to discover who we are, the so-called life review, telling the stories about what's happened in our life. This makes life events more meaningful than would be the case if we were to see events in isolation with no connection to each other. Telling a story, telling what's happened to us, requires a life review. And this can be very painful. So I think it is a process that has to be approached cautiously, because sometimes it means looking at the discrepancies between the fantasies that we had early in life, the way we hoped life would unfold, and the way in which life actually unfolded. And as we do this kind of work, we find that a great deal of grief emerges. We have to look at disappointments. We have to look at goals that we had that we now realize will never be met, and so on. But at least telling the story helps us make sense of life. And telling the story to other people is an important means of connecting to other people. And it's an important means of passing on wisdom to other people. Whatever wisdom one has acquired, one can pass on to the family. One becomes, as an elder, the repository of all the family history. And all the wisdom that one has acquired can be passed on, ideally, to the next generation. This is what Erickson meant by generativity in later in life. Now, sometimes we feel that our life has been guided to follow a particular pattern, as if we have a kind of transpersonal calling. Jung calls this the spiritus rector, the guiding spirit, which is the self within the personality. And that's what he meant when he said that each life has its own telos, its own goal, its own purpose, its own end point, and its own vocation, really, that each personality has an end or a goal that's given by the self. And the problem is how to discern it. And the work on dreams and the individuation process is one way to discern that process. Now, if you don't have a spiritual orientation, if you have a more sort of atheistic existentialist bent, the most you can do later in life is to find your own meaning or to project meaning into your life. But whether you do it through this kind of spiritual process or whether you do it through an existentialist process, if you can find meaning, it helps you to affirm the value of your life. Now, there are people who spend their lives finding meaning in the pursuit of acquisitions like power or status or money. These become pursuits that are problematic if they're just ways of shoring up a fragile sense of self. Sometimes they are expressions of creativity, and that can be very valuable. But if you're just using the acquisition of power and status and titles and so on to shore yourself up because you have a fragile sense of self, that's likely to become a problem in old age. These pursuits of power and status become less available, and they are of reduced value. It becomes much more important to develop relationships that matter to you, to develop love and friendship, to work on the future of the family, to help with future generations, to become a mentor. Those become much more important than the acquisition of possessions. Another very important pursuit in this context is a creative development. Creativity allows passion in one's life, devotion to another person, to a cause, to meaningful work, to an artistic endeavor. All these will allow transcendence of the individual personality and put you in touch with the creative sources of the personality. If you've experienced suffering in your life, as most of us have, you might discover that your own experience with suffering enables you to help other people with similar difficulties. I mentioned Erickson's stress on integrity, the acceptance of one's life the way it has been, rather than succumbing to despair. This is a real developmental achievement, but it's also spiritually important. Without the sense that life has been worth living, it's very hard to come to terms with death. And if we do not come to terms with death, we will either have to deny it or be terrified of it. So this leads into the issue of surrender and acceptance in old age, what I would refer to as transformative surrender. And here again, I'm reminded of Jung's words that the experience of the self is always a defeat for the ego. Eventually, we come to understand that we have much less control over the major events of our lives than we imagine. Things happen to us that we could never have imagined.
Sorry, guys, on that exact note, I think I gotta go. There's just so much going on around me. There are helicopters nonstop. I'm getting reports on my phone of multiple structure fires within a half a mile. I think I need to go and be aware. Sorry to interrupt. I'm sure it'll be, meaningful completion. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just feeling a little.
Okay, sorry you're having to go through that. But I guess that's just synchronistically what I was talking about when I said we have much less control over the major events of our life than we imagined. Who could have imagined the present situation? Which I think is an emergence from the self, from what Jung calls the dark side of the self, which is responsible for suffering and evil.
If you need a place to be,
I think he's gone, yes. So wisdom partly consists in getting to know which of these kind of transpersonal determinants are the most significant to the individual. Which of our archetypal endowment is most significant to us. Now, one of the most important spiritual accomplishments in late life is the development of the capacity for surrender in a situation in which we have no control over what's arisen. Sometimes this is called letting go, but there are plenty of opportunities for that in later life. We might be in a situation of suffering or disability or illness and so on, in which or bereavement or loss and so on, in which we've tried everything we know how to do to deal with the situation. We've done all the sensible measures that we could try. But there comes a point where very often in later life, it's a mistake to continue to insist on independence and mastery. Instead, what we have to cultivate sometimes in these situations is radical acceptance. Exploration of the meaning of the situation can be far more valuable than the attempt to maintain independence and mastery. The heroic attitude to suffering is very appropriate to the first part of life as the ego is developing. But the later parts of life require a kind of anti-heroic attitude, a submission to the larger reality, which Jung talks about as the self. Now, the way we do this can vary. If you are an older person who's committed to a traditional religion, then surrender to a difficult situation may mean acceptance of what you will experience as the divine will, however you imagine that in your tradition. And that process of surrender or letting go will foster your connection to the transcendent dimension. And if you can do that, it will allow relief from struggle and a sense of peace. It means that you can accept your limitations, your vulnerabilities, and very importantly in later life, it means that you will allow mature dependence on other people. Sometimes this happens for the first time in later life. And sometimes this need for other people will actually enhance your capacity for relationship, sometimes to new heights that you've never had before. Surrender of this kind may require that you let go of a lifelong need to control everything that happens in your life and to control other people. This is especially difficult for people with a narcissistic character structure. If you have a character structure which wants to control other people, which is inflated, that may be a defense against very painful emptiness. And then it's very hard to let go of that kind of defense. So this may not be an approach that works for everyone. Surrender may also be difficult for people who lack basic trust. Basic trust is something that develops very early in childhood when we get good early care from our early caregivers. And we develop the sense that things are basically going to work out okay because we're going to get the help that we need. That's what Erickson referred to as basic trust. And it's one of the sources of religious faith. But if you've never had the opportunity to develop basic trust, this process of surrender may be impossible. The other problem with the notion of surrender is that it may be difficult because in the culture we value autonomy very much, and sometimes surrender might mean that we have to give up autonomy. We don't want to suggest that surrender is a kind of failure. It isn't a form of failure. It's actually spiritually and psychologically transformative. It doesn't mean that you don't act. Surrender does not mean that you don't try and deal with the situation. It simply means that you act out of an understanding that the situation is out of your control and you have to somehow go along with the situation and not struggle against it. The ship is leaving. There's no point in holding on to the dock. If this is possible, it becomes transformative. One of the main developments in later life is that we are losing something biologically all the time, but we can gain psychologically and we can gain spiritually at the same time as we're losing biological processes. So the spiritually valuable aspect of loss in later life and suffering in later life is the possibility that it allows for letting go of the dominance of the ego and for releasing us from the demands of social convention. I don't want to minimize the painful aspects of aging, but I want to show that some older people can compensate for loss by developing a closer connection to the self and by developing a spirituality that sees their life in the context of life as a whole, part of the larger chain of being. Now, I don't want this to seem as if this kind of approach is only confined to Jung. There are many authors who write about this kind of approach to later life. I don't want it to sound too idealized or too prescriptive. It's not confined to Jung. There's another important writer I want to mention in this context called Lars Tornstam. That's spelled Tornstam. And he has a process that he calls gerotranscendence. And it's very similar to Jung. He says it represents the desire for communion with an entity greater than oneself. It doesn't have to be the God image of your childhood. It simply means, gerotranscendence means a shift in a person's perspective from purely material physical concerns to a more transcendent view of reality. And this is often accompanied by an increase in life satisfaction. Transcendence does not mean detachment from ordinary physical life. It means that you feel part of the larger picture, part of a chain of generations, part of the larger unity of life. And often this leads to an increased interest in everyday experiences, so that we start to feel transcendence within the ordinary. Another angle on this is that if you look at all the world's mythic and folkloric traditions, as they deal with older protagonists, there are studies of folklore and mythology and fairy tales in which the main protagonist is an older man or woman. And in these stories, in myth and folklore, the elders will always be concerned with transpersonal tasks, not just personality development. What you find in this kind of folklore and mythology with older protagonists is that the individual is concerned with their existence as part of the totality of the world. And sometimes they are transformed by encounters with numinous figures that take them beyond the ego. But what happens in the folklore is that the elders reach a stage at which they can free themselves from social convention. And they develop a kind of state of spontaneity that makes them in a way quite innocent and quite childlike. Now, I mentioned earlier that we have to come to terms with death. Sometimes this includes belief in the survival of some kind of consciousness after death or reincarnation. And if you believe in that, it may be quite comforting. But facing the reality of death makes us ask what our life has meant and what really matters to us. If we're used to letting go of the ego, not clinging to the ego, then the prospect of death provokes less anxiety. Death, we realize, becomes a form of transcendence in its own right. And there are a variety of modes of death transcendence. You might see yourselves as reflected in your children or in your society that gives you a sense of continuity. You might leave some work or creative product that you're identified with that allows a sense of transcendence. You might believe in the immortality of the soul. You might feel a part of nature. All these attitudes are a matter of personal commitment, of course, but they allow us to prepare with some equanimity for the inevitability of death. What's needed is enough psychological and spiritual work to feel a sense of completion, which is why Jung was able to say that we actually go into analysis so that we can die. He meant that we could do this preparation for death. We can do the psychological work that's necessary for a sense of completion. The exploration of the inner world is a spiritual practice in its own right. And in old age, this exploration can become more important than responding to the demands of society. The experience of many older people is that contemplation becomes more important than activity in the world. So Jungian psychology, with its emphasis on dream work and the inner life and the individuation process, has a great deal to offer older people who want to develop a personal spirituality without adherence to any specific tradition. By paying attention to dreams and that kind of manifestation of the self, we gain access to the same source that gives rise to traditional religions, but we discover a unique relationship with that level. There's no need for any institution. There's no need for any Bible or hierarchy. You might, when you do this kind of work, discover symbolic material in your dreams that suggests that you do belong to the tradition in which you were raised. But you may discover imagery that's entirely different than the tradition in which you were raised. You may be able to free yourself from all traditions. And in Jung's words, you may be able to stand before the nothing out of which all may grow. I think this approach actually is the next stage in our religious evolution. It's actually a new myth of God based on the development of a new God image. Well, I see it's about 10:30, which is when I wanted to finish, and perhaps we can now have a conversation.
Lionel, thank you so much. And this is for you and for Connie. What caught my attention was the idea of life review. And what I'm aware of is in the experiences of individuals who have near-death experiences, that there is oftentimes the experience of a life review in that near-death experience. And I've been doing this myself, is writing and just really finding the numerous coincidences that I really wasn't conscious of before. So maybe for a moment you could speak to that. And Connie, I would love to hear your thoughts on this process of life review, because I think it's extremely important.
Well, let me turn over to Connie so that I'm sure you have something to say about this.
Okay. The very first time I did a life review was only 2 years ago, because I'm not oriented to looking at the past, Gard. I've been very oriented to looking at the future. And what I realized as I did this process, and I did it visually, I had a horizontal piece of paper, and I drew a line and drew the decades. And really tried to recreate the key moments and people in my life. And what I realized is that the traditional life review does not include the unlived life in the shadow. So I went below the horizontal line and looked at, well, if this was expressed above the line in our conscious ego's life, what was repressed in the unconscious? And I began to see the story that was living beneath conscious awareness, which became a spiritual practice for me. So I continue to work on that and unfold my relationship to the unlived life. One of the themes Lionel mentioned that Jung spoke about telos, about the theme that the soul's journey unfolds in an individual life. And it's hard for some people to see that, but it was actually quite easy for me to see that in my own life. I saw that in 5 distinct careers, what I call my soul's mission was to transmit information about consciousness. And because I saw how many different forms that took, it oriented me to my later life, to my 70s now, to continue that mission. And that's part of the reason that I wrote this book. That discovery from the life review was quite unifying for me and gave my distinct life stages and careers a unified sense of telos, or purpose.
Mhm.
So I highly recommend this practice. And in the book, I go very precisely into how to do a shadow life review.
Yeah, but I think it's very important, but there is the caveat that you might come across a great deal of grief.
Yes.
You may have to rework grief, but that's,
But the experience of that grief, at least for me in my life review, Lionel, was created a quality of an opening
yeah.
to the possibility of deeper meaning.
Hmm.
And so again, I understand if it's very traumatic and it's deep, as Jung says, maybe a little analysis would be good in that situation.
Yeah.
But the experience of mourning really is a door opener in that life review process for me.
And telling your story to another person is very helpful because you have a reflecting consciousness. You have somebody who can talk about what happened to you and make you aware of things that you simply couldn't see yourself. And so the life review, I think, can be done in a group or with another person very, very usefully.
Now, the other observation is right now with the coronavirus, we've talked about the disproportionality with people of color, but what I am now aware of is over 40,000 of the people that have died over the 100,000 people have been older people in homes.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me culturally, we have a deep shadow in how we treat old age, that we have created warehouses for age and we don't want to see it. And I think a big part of the opportunity here is to open ourselves up to, as you say, the integrity of the whole life process, and that old age needs to be taken into account and not warehoused in a way that allows it to disappear.
Yeah, we have to realize it has a purpose. Otherwise it wouldn't be happening.
Yeah, yeah.
I think age segregation and ageism has come to light. It's one of the issues that's come to light with the virus.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. And then I'm thinking about, and I know you've written a lot about Job, and Job's experience through his life, right, in the story at least, led him to a place where through a numinous experience, he could say, even though he slay me, yet will I serve him. And that strikes me as Edinger, as Job sort of breaking through to a new appreciation of this superordinate reality, the self, and recognizing that perhaps those old images of a slayer and of a vengeful God really don't work anymore.
Yeah. That's why he said, before I'd heard about you, but now I see you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that is so much of religion.
You're not what they told me in Sunday school.
I think there's also a collective Job story being lived right now.
Yeah.
With one loss after another after another. And the glaring absence of the relationship to the transpersonal or the divine in the collective as these losses continue to accrue.
Yes, this morning I was talking to an African-American young lady who just stayed up all night. She was in tears. She was writing, she was posting. And she said, you know, the ideas of going out and cleaning up the mess and of painting murals and all this is fine short term. But there's something much deeper here. And she said, I'm troubled by it. And she said, spirituality doesn't work. And I said, I think that reflects a lack of understanding of spirituality, that compassion is really not a mushy sentiment, but it is a powerful lever for active change. Mm-hmm. And I think that, as you said about age, with wisdom comes that appreciation that these are not sentimental emotions. These are empathic concerns that lead to action.
Yeah. And older people get better at dealing with intense emotions because we just had more practice at it.
Yeah. And your appreciation of trust, it strikes me that the words you use, surrender, right? All of these words lead back to this word trust. And if there is to be any rejuvenation of institutions of religion, that word trust really has to come into play. That childlike attitude that is garnered in old age really provides that capacity for trust, which we're not given that in early age, right? The ego's way too dominant to allow us to trust too much. So could you speak to that a little bit more?
Well, I think the development, I mentioned Erickson's notion of basic trust, which is a developmental achievement that only happens if you have reasonably good caretakers in childhood, so that when the child is distressed, somebody comes to help the child time and again, and then you realize that help is available. That's how trust develops. If you have predatory, unavailable parents, you can never develop trust. And then you have to be a predator yourself. And you can't trust anyone. All you can do is demand loyalty, but you can't actually trust anyone.
Yeah. And this idea of standing before the no thing, that to me strikes me as the fundamental shift in the image of deity. That God is not a thing. This superordinate self doesn't have 2 arms and 2 legs and a head and a penis. But is something much more extraordinary than any of those traditional images. Could you speak about that? Because that part of the apophatic traditions of spirituality really sort of...
Well, I wanted to let Connie have some
please.
I think this is a really good opportunity to make the transition. I was so grateful when Connie decided, or when I asked her to come on board, and Lionel graciously included her. Her book, Inner Work of Age, How to Shift from Role to Soul, it'll be coming out. And there are any number of good projects that relate to the demographic that we're all part of. I mean, when we were young children, they built elementary schools. And as that population grew into the corporations and grew into schools and what have you, as we've gone through, we've affected an entire population of people. It's affecting the senior citizen homes now. You know, my mother-in-law just passed away last fall in a Sunrise Living facility. There's a lot of us. There really are. And Connie has a talk that she's specially prepared for this that's called Reimagining Our Spiritual Beliefs and Practices in Later Life. This time calls for reimagining. And as we're looking out at the culture right now that is in turmoil, this entire world that we Will left, he's going out, he's got fires and helicopters in his neighborhood. He wouldn't have left. I mean, you know, there's emergencies that we need to take care of and tend to, but we all have to do this together. And I'm really appreciative that Connie would come on with us this morning and offer her perspectives on reimagining our spiritual beliefs and practices at this time in our life. So, Connie, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dana. Thank you for inviting me. You know, I think that Lionel really set up the context for the journey of individuation into late life. And I want to just kind of pose this question as my launching moment, which is, how do we make the conditions that we're living in today, the conditions of being older during a pandemic and now during a social uprising, how do we make those conditions conducive to our spiritual development? How do we link our inner work to the cultural moment and the social context in which we're living as baby boomers, as people in our 50s, 60s, 70s, who really want to do this work. 80s too. I don't know why I stopped there. So what I want to do is it's almost like Lionel gave us the macrocosm, and now I'm going to narrow the focus and do a bit of microcosm in sort of how we might take on this work. A couple of months ago, one of my best friends died of cancer, and her death left me kind of sitting in a well of grief for a while, for a long while. And not for the reason that you might think. Cindy was a student of Swami Muktananda, with whom she encountered sexual shadow. And later she was a follower of Swami Vishwananda, with whom she also encountered sexual shadow. And while she was studying with him, the last teacher, she attained a very high stage of witness awareness and internal bliss. Being with her, the bliss was contagious, and this lasted for a couple of years. So when his sexual acting out and his lies came to light, Cindy was devastated, and she was very conflicted about whether to stay or to leave this community. Her spiritual disillusionment really triggered a dark night of the soul for her. When she was first diagnosed, after a lifetime of spiritual practice, I would say probably 5 decades, she was really able to maintain her witness awareness, her detachment during the first cycle of chemotherapy. But during the second cycle, when her body was really full of toxins and her brain became foggy, she lost her awareness and she reverted to an earlier stage of development in which her sort of fixated past emotional issues surfaced. And eventually she no longer knew what she believed. She no longer knew whether her practices meant anything at all. And she lost all faith, and she lost trust in life. And she faced death with feelings of anger and betrayal at the gods. So, although I was able to help her complete a lot of legal and medical unfinished business, I was not able to help her complete her spiritual unfinished business. And that's the source of my sorrow. She did not die in peace after all that spiritual practice. Mm. And so that really led me on to this question. What is life completion? What does it mean to do practices like myself for 50 years and then to face death? To even contemplate death, as Lionel was saying. Because if we're not in denial at our age, I'm 71, we recognize that death is imminent. So many people who are now in late life felt a longing in our youth for transcendence, for a connection to something larger than ourselves, whether that something had an archetypal image attached to it, or whether it did not, like the big nothing that we were just talking about. It was something beyond ego that we intuited and that we yearned for. And many of us experimented with that, and many of us found some relationship to it, some connection to it. And like my friend, many of us suffered some kind of betrayal and consequent disillusionment with our spiritual teachers, our communities, and our practices. Lionel referred to disillusionment with handed down organized religious teachings. But many of us also had heartbreak with Eastern traditions and those chosen traditions that we took on that were distinct from the lineages in which we grew up. So today, as elders, it seems to me that it's really necessary that we contemplate again what we believe, what we most cherish, and what we most value, and to reflect on our past beliefs and perhaps revise them if they no longer serve our development. Bring them into awareness and question them. And in this way, it's possible to create our own late life philosophy and our own personal experience of the divine or the numinous or the transpersonal, whatever we call it, or the self. So these are some of the questions that come up for me. Are we connected to something larger than ourselves? As a mystic poet Kabir put it, who have we spent our entire life loving? Is there a deeper purpose to our lives that we can see now, and are we connected to it? What is the role of the mind, of the heart, of the body? Are we caring for them in a balanced way at this time in our lives? And what's our connection to service? You know, I feel my heart is with the protesters, but I'm not in the streets. So it's creating a lot of internal conflict for me this moment. What is our connection to the suffering of humanity? And then, is death a final end? Or is it the beginning of a new cycle? How do we hold that at this moment in our lives? And, you know, many of us, most people probably will deny this task, will deny the developmental tasks of later life, and they'll deny the opportunities that come with this inner work. And as a result, their beliefs will remain hidden in the shadow, and their images of the divine will remain hidden to them and will not develop because the opportunity is missed. In my book, I talk about inner obstacles for each of the sections of the work, and this is the 7th inner obstacle. We continue to unconsciously identify with past religious beliefs and images, and we fail to repair our relationship to the divine. So I have a friend who was raised Methodist, and she was taught to get up and do good works every day. And several years after retirement, she didn't want to wake up and do anymore. She wanted to sit by the lake and watch the birds. But guilt gnawed at her, and so she needed to become aware of those early teachings, and she needed to choose consciously whether to obey them now or not to. A client who was a Christian Scientist watched as her parents in their 80s became ill and were forced to choose between using medicine, which is forbidden by their church, and doing nothing. And in their 80s, they both went to the doctor for the first time in their lives. And as a result, their church shunned them. And my client said, all of my doubts came crashing in, and I left. And then I read about Jimmy Carter, the ex-president, who at 94 resigned from the Southern Baptist Convention after 60 years. I don't know if you saw that, but he publicly said he could no longer tolerate its institutional sexism. So many of us have spent decades asking these existential questions of meaning, doing spiritual practices, maybe one after another, maybe staying with one of them for a long time. And we've spent time identifying with the teachings, right? With the dogma. Whether it's yoga or Judaism, Advaita or Christianity, Sufism or existentialism, in some cases we unconsciously identified so deeply with our beliefs that we came to see them as who we are. I am evangelical. I am Muslim. I am Tibetan Buddhist. Dare I say, I am Jungian. And in the same way that we identified with our work roles, I am a CEO, or I am an entrepreneur, I am a mother, I am an actor. Our egos identified with our spiritual roles and our philosophical ideas, and we became fundamentalist thinkers, grasping onto the beliefs with the death grip without realizing it. And I was so struck in Lionel's talk about fundamentalism, how you describe this mechanism that happens around political and religious dogma. But we don't tend to think of ourselves as fundamentalists, and many of us have done that, right? Veganism will cure you, or this is the only path to enlightenment, or my church alone can save you, or I only trust what I can see. Because science can be a dogma too, empiricism. And so there's a way in which this identification with dogma is so important in late life, because it's exactly what we see on the world stage right now. It's exactly what we see in politics. It's exactly what we see in global religious tribalism. And I want to suggest that as elders, we need to ask ourselves if we have been fundamentalist in our thinking in any way. If we've believed in something so fervently that we fail to see other points of view, we've become blinded by self-righteousness, and we've sacrificed certain parts of ourselves into the shadow that were essential to our well-being. And for some of us, that's what happened in our religious and spiritual communities. Certainly in mine, in my 20s, when I began transcendental meditation, I became a fundamentalist. And I highly recommend the movie Wild, what's it called? Wild, Wild. It's a movie about Osho or Rajneesh that was playing on Netflix. That's a documentary of the development of that community, Wild Wild Country, I think it is. It's absolutely a profound teaching in that.
What was the name again? The title
I think it's
again?
Wild Wild Country.
Wild Wild.
It's a movie about Rajneesh or Osho. It's very worth seeing. So, and then of course, within our blindfolds, in our churches and spiritual communities and synagogues and mosques, somebody acts out, or there's emotional coercion, or there's financial coercion, or there's hypocrisy, right? And we tell ourselves, well, he can't be enlightened, or he wouldn't do that. Or she has secrets, so she's not who I thought she was, or he lied about celibacy, or whatever it is. We saw the Catholic Church scandal in the clergy, childhood sexual abuse in the 90s. And so, as Hillman says, in the very place where we put our trust, we were betrayed. And our innocence is lost, and our faith is shaken. And in order to do repair in late life, in order to complete our spiritual unfinished business, we need to recover from these wounds. And we need to clarify how this happened and how to move forward, so that if we have disconnected from our spiritual yearning to connect with the transcendent, with the self, we can rediscover that again. We can rejoin our path in preparation for death. So part of this, of course, is about projection. Just as we project our dark shadows onto others, we also unconsciously project our spiritual light. And we give away, unknowingly, we give away our spiritual essence to others. You know, we might say, Jesus talks to him and I want that, or she has the light that I'm seeking, or he's liberated and I'm not. And so our yearning is directed to a person who may or may not have a higher stage of awareness. You know, in some cases they do. And yet, this person is also flawed and human and has limits and blind spots. And so as a result, our longing for the light evokes its opposite, an encounter with spiritual darkness. And we are emptied out of hope and meaning and images of the divine. So before spiritual betrayal, we are innocent, trusting believers. And this is so much the story of Job as well. We're the chosen, we're the saved, we're the enlightened ones, we have God on our side. And after spiritual betrayal, we enter the night sea journey, the via negativa. In the Christian mythos, this is the time of the cross, right? Why have you forsaken me? And at first we might deny, this is always our first response, to deny that this has happened. And in this effort, we're denying the imperfection of another human being, and we're denying the limitations of our practices. And internally, we may be denying hidden thoughts and feelings, a gnawing doubt, you know, a buried question that eventually erupt into awareness. And then one day we can't tolerate it anymore, and we admit that despite our faith in a church or in a guru's promise, despite our yoga practice or hours of sitting practice, we still struggle with shadow, with our teacher's shadow or our own shadow. And if we strive for perfection, it inevitably fails us. The ego's quest for perfection traps us in a longing that cannot be fulfilled. So for us boomers, probably hundreds of thousands of us, this spectacle has cast a pall over our spiritual lives, and it's brought about disorientation in later life, disconnection from the purpose that Lionel was talking about, and widespread depression, addiction, anxiety, which are all exacerbated now by, you know, our collective experience of one trauma after another one. So a fortunate few of us have found the narrow path through the darkness and experienced what I call betrayal as initiation. And we traveled from spiritual innocence through the descent into a liminal world and toward a new stage of awareness, spiritual maturity. We evolved from victim and victimizer, from childlike dependency on a spiritual parent, through meeting the shadow and accepting it as part of the path towards spiritual adulthood. And Lionel, you mentioned mature dependency or mature interdependence. And so in this process, our projections collapsed, right? Wise and innocent, right and wrong, enlightened and ignorant, saint and sinner. And we came to see that the opposites exist together in us and in our teachers and in our loved ones. Shadow and wisdom, humanity and divinity exist together. And so we could then, at that stage, we then can learn to carry, and this is what I want to kind of focus on now. We can learn to carry our own wounds and our own spiritual essence, our own light and our own limitations. And so how do we do this? How do we move through to the next stage of this journey if what I'm describing is your experience? And Lionel spoke about our connection dreams, which was really Jung's focus, I think, his primary method. And I want to suggest a couple of other practices for us. So one is reclaiming our own light. It was Nelson Mandela who said, our deepest fear is not that we're inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we're powerful beyond measure. It's our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. And I think this is why we so easily give away our light, whether to a priest or a guru or an analyst. We project that part of ourselves and ask the other person to mediate the divine for us. And so as a result, we identify with a narrow role. I'm a patient, I'm a follower, I'm a student, I'm a disciple. And we take no, that was not, I'm going to respond to the chat. Marianne Williamson took that from Nelson Mandela. So as we identify with this more subordinate position, what happens is we can maintain that position for decades and deny our own spiritual authority. And so what I'm suggesting is that as we reclaim our spiritual authority, we reclaim a connection to the self, a connection to the divine within us. We no longer need to give it away and follow. We begin to, I'm not going to engage the debate. We begin to find ways to create our own spiritual, to reconnect with our own spiritual nature. And, what I would urge, if some of you are interested in this, is that we need our own direct connection to pure, what I call pure awareness, or the big no thing, or the silent vastness within us. And I think Lionel mentioned it's through experience, not through beliefs, that this spiritual development happens. So I'm going to come in a few minutes to how do we find a practice in later life that will allow us to have direct experience, no longer rely on another human or on beliefs and dogma in order to cultivate this. Secondly, we need to reclaim our beliefs. We need to question, if we gave away the power of definition to another person or to another group or to another set of beliefs, we need to begin to question whether that is now appropriate for us, given who we are, given all the life experience that we bring to this moment. Are our beliefs current? Have they developed along with us? Do we still define right and wrong and God's on our side in that kind of thinking? Whereas what Lionel mentioned, we can now hold paradox, we can now hold ambiguity. If that's the case, then are our beliefs current to who we are now? I have some quotes here from some clients. I lived all my life as a good Catholic. What if it's all a lie? It's frightening to doubt. I understand that. Why am I doing these Buddhist practices? What do they have to do with me? I want to leave this retreat before it's over, but I'm afraid. Is this Sufi belief system true, or is it a crutch? So I understand that when you begin to doubt, there are cracks in the system. And that is why experience with practices is so important. So that the ground of experience holds up the changing of the gods in our belief system. I'm going to just move along here. Reclaiming our images of divinity, as Lionel spoke about. There is a lot of research now in the psychology of religion that these images develop, that they evolve through a lifetime. And we may be unaware of how these archetypal images have guided us if they are outside of awareness. It's like a hidden object of desire. We long for it and we don't even see it. And so to begin to make conscious some of these images and what they are arousing, what they are evoking in us. During the pandemic, Kali has been coming to me a lot. Kali is the Hindu image of destruction, but she's also the image of birth and death and the full cycle of life with destruction as a part of it. So what are the archetypal images that you can begin to find, and again, in your dreams, or in your creative works, or in your free association? You could ask, who is there? Who's calling to you? So I would say that this is a little known task, other than among Jungians. This is a very little known task for late life, to uncover these images and to begin to dialogue with them, to begin to allow them to transform within us. When I interviewed Lionel for my book, Lionel, I'm going to quote you. You said to me, age has a function. It's to renew our inner image of God. And that's a kind of spirituality that's more authentic than the collective given traditions offered to us. So I had a client, Steve, who identified himself as a Buddhist and practiced mindfulness. But in his shadow, a wrathful Pope was sending him to hell for his sexual fantasies, no matter how much he tried to purify his mind. And so these kind of long neglected images are a source of suffering at the end of life. And in order for us to really complete our unfinished business, it's important that we come to terms with them. As Bob Dylan put it, you got to serve somebody. Who are we serving toward the end of our lives? Okay, reclaiming our practices. Do I have time, Dana? Yeah? Okay, so how to choose the right meditation practice in later life. So every mystical and perennial tradition teaches that it's only through our direct experience of pure awareness, of emptiness, of the divine, whatever we call it, the silent vastness, that we can move beyond ego and fully cross the threshold from role to soul. So when Lionel was speaking about relativizing the ego, there are many, many ways to work with that, psychological and spiritual ways. My orientation is deep meditation, aside from the spiritual work. And because in late life, we no longer need to kind of go, and carry the burden of big responsibilities, we can slow, we can sit, we can allow our minds to settle down into open, spacious, timeless, pure awareness. And tying this back to our current conditions, it seems to me, and people may disagree with me, but it seems to me that now more than ever, we need a refuge. We need to find, and when I was watching his phone and watching him grow agitated, I want to suggest that we all need, whether it's 20 minutes a day or an hour a day, time to turn within and silence our minds and settle our nervous systems. And that is not self-centered in a small self way, that is not escapism, that is not narcissistic, that is actually an appropriate response to the moment, and will give us a sense of how to act when we come out, whether we take social action, however it is that we respond to these crises. So finding a practice. When I spoke with Mirabai Bush, who's the co-author with Ramdas on his last book, Walking Each Other Home, which is about facing death, she told me that different practices work at different times in our lives. She said, I used mindfulness for 50 years, but then I needed other practices. When I had an emotionally hard time, I learned Aikido, and I could center my body, mind in the moment, and my attention was fixed. She said, when I'm with friends, I practice chanting or kirtan. And as I age, I find hatha yoga more important to maintain flexibility. So you may find a practice by spiritual reading and an intuitive recognition of a fit. You may find it through people who share your values, or through opening to synchronicity and allowing it to lead you somewhere. You may find it by recording your dreams, or hearing a friend say something, or traveling to another culture and feeling at home there. You may find it in a sacred place in nature, or by serving others for the common good. And you may find it by returning to a practice from your youth with your life experience in tow. So if you trust your inner guidance and attune to your intuition, you may find it by looking within. But I want to suggest that you listen for the voices of the shadows, because they'll tell you, I can't concentrate, it's too late for this, I can't cross my legs, it didn't help before. And when you hear those self-sabotaging voices, allow yourself to just observe them without obeying them. And listen to this whisper from your soul that's longing for more, that's saying to you, I feel drawn to that. Or I wonder what that would be like. Or this one feels familiar to me. And trust that over the shadow voices. And then whatever practice you choose, look for the fit. the felt sense of resonance with a lineage or a teaching? Are you drawn to the myth of Jesus becoming the Christ? Or Siddhartha becoming the Buddha? Are you drawn to the myth and music of longing for the Messiah? Or the pantheon of Hindu gods, Shiva, Ram, Hanuman, Sita, Kali, each with its own myth and archetypal images? So as you approach, if you go to a teacher or a community, be sure to use your discrimination, right? Watch for projection. Watch for dogma and groupthink. Watch for subtle allusions to hierarchy or shaming. And remember that you're no longer a young, naive seeker who blindly follows others. So how can you heed the call today and maintain your shadow awareness? How can you move from being a heroic seeker to an elder seeker and age into awakening? There's a whole, what is an elder, a spiritual elder? There's a whole universe in there. So I have some suggestions of practices here. Should I continue or should I stop?
Connie, I'm going to suggest that what we do, I'm going to put your contact information along with Lionel's. And it sounds, as I've heard before from your other time of coming to the Myth Salon, was that you are receptive to having people contact you. And I want to thank you very much for the richness and the, not a digression, but an amplification of what Lionel brought to us today. There's a line that I had back in the days when I wrote folk songs, but it goes like this: I wish I knew a story that would open up your heart. When doubt and indecision happen, trust begins to start. And I would like to say that the more we can move to a universal sense rather than a particular qualified sense of trust, the more divine our actions and our concepts become. As we become less judgmental, as we become more tolerant, as we become more compassionate in terms of who and what we can accept and love, that we walk the walk that seems to be talking to us, and that we really can move beyond self-reference to a universal condition of love. And there's so much to be gained from moving beyond a relativized ego. I would like to thank all of you, and Lionel, would you say something just to kind of bring this, or wait a minute, let me go to Gard, my good friend Gard. Gard, why don't you texted about Jung and circumambulation, and I think that's a good journey, because we're all on these wandering paths, and we have all found ways of being guided by forces that are beyond us that we may not have understood when we first embarked upon them. But if you'd say something about that, and then hand it off to Lionel, and let's bring it up. And
Please. And
beautiful morning.
Yeah, absolutely. So Lionel, I was struck by the image. Yes, the square, but within the square, the circle. And the circle is the circumambulation. And in my own life, the recognition that it is not just the body, it's not just the heart, it's not just the head, it's not just the soul. It's all 4 points on the circumambulation on the circle, which brings wholeness. And so in my own life, practices around those 4 points have been quite helpful in the journey. So I really want to thank you for that image. It was a very powerful image, as you say, a big dream. And Connie, your contribution, extraordinary as always. I was honored to be your student at Pacifica, and I'm still honored to be your student now. So thank you. Lionel?
Well, I just want to thank Dana for bringing us together. and I hope it's been helpful to people.
Well, as Connie said, you got to serve somebody. And those of you who know me know since I first joined in this pursuit, I've been trying to do this sort of thing. And I've been fortunate to be allied with people like Gard Jameson. I mean, he's just a beautiful individual. I mean, I just can't say enough. And what the love that has been brought into my life by giving up doing and focusing on the quality of being is just, I just can't say enough of it. So, you know, that's been my evolution as a person just going through life and dealing with life's changes.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
I think
Well,
if we all, I think part of what's important today in this moment is to link our spiritual work to the common good and not to kind of insulate or silo or separate our inner work and our outer work, and really kind of hold as if we are doing a spiritual practice, we can bless the people in the street. If we can bless the police, which I never would have done as a young student in Berkeley, right? We can move from the I to the we to the all of us and really hold humanity, which I believe is at a crossroads in our hearts with compassion. So thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed the morning.
And I
Thank
hope
you.
that everyone here has really enjoyed their morning and come away with a deeper sense of clarification about the kinds of mental, spiritual, and emotional pursuits are worth undertaking, and devote ourselves to it such that our lives become a vehicle for transformation.